Welcome to the Midsters Podcast, your podcast for inspiration on being bold and saying yes to making the most out of your midlife. It could be light, it could be deep, it could be healing, it could be inspiring, because we're talking about origin stories. I don't think it's anything that we sit and think about a lot, but I think it does mold us to who we are. I would say the first thoughts of origin story in my life is listening to my parents and my grandparents talk about what life was like for them. But I'm interested. We'll start it out in a discussion. We'll start it out with a question. Do you find that your origin story, when you first realized where you came from as a child, that it has led you in a certain path, certain direction, or how it's influenced you today?
You know, it's interesting that you say you think people don't think about their origin story, because I think about mine all the time. And I definitely grew up with an awareness of being Italian. Like, we were an Italian-American family in a community that was largely Italian-American, and my grandparents only spoke Italian. And culturally, we did a lot of things that were very Italian. We ate pasta like multiple times a week. We would go into New York to celebrate the Feast of San Gennaro in August. So there was definitely that cultural piece of it that I was raised with, and it's inherent in who I am, and it still is.
That's interesting. Well, and you are from a full Italian background. And so when I say that I don't think about it, it's nothing that I ponder a lot. And I do embrace different pieces of my origin, but I had an American father, and I lived in England, Singapore, and Australia. So I didn't embrace that American piece until much later. And my mother was from Scotland, and we visited Scotland very well of Scotland, but I didn't feel full Scottish either. And then we moved to Arkansas, which, yes, it's in the U.S., maybe. No, I'm kidding. I love Arkansas. No offense to anybody that's from Arkansas. So it wasn't like living, eating, smelling, speaking Italian as what you're talking about. Mine was a little bit more complicated than that. But I do think about who I am today and how my parents lived and what their origin stories are that influenced me. My parents are extremely adventurous, have always been adventurous, not so much in their older age, but my father, born in 1932 during the Depression, went and signed up for the Army, was in the Korean War, loved the Army, not the war, but loved the travel and exploring other countries, went into becoming a geophysicist, and actually chose to go to the Congo, to go to the North Sea, loved that travel and that adventure. My mother left at 18 and moved from Scotland to England and could not have been happier to have lived all around the world. There is that adventurous spirit, and that is in me. So their origin story is definitely part of the way I live today, and I love that.
I think part of what is important for my origin story is a little more, certainly there was an awareness of who my parents were and what their lives were like. And they also grew up during the Depression. My dad actually fought in World War II. Like your dad, he loved the travel part of it, but he never talked about the war experience. But that was certainly fundamental to who he was, and I knew that. And my mom, she grew up with a larger family, very family oriented. I knew that too. But I think for me, part of what's my origin story that's always been really kind of important, and I think about this, I was fortunate enough to grow up in an intact 2-parent home. And, I grew up in an era where you were beginning to see parents getting divorced. And that has a whole different flavor to family life and how you view yourself.
Right.
I had, a brother and a sister, so one of each. We lived in a nice middle-class suburban neighborhood. We went to good schools. I had what I think was very mid-century, 20th century America middle-class upbringing. And that definitely affects my worldview.
Right.
I try to be really conscious of that. Like, that is my worldview. So when I interact with other people, I often will think, okay, where I'm coming from may not be where they're coming from. And you have to factor that in.
Right. You know, I have a similar background with a family that's stayed intact, though there's wonderful families that don't. I mean, but mine stayed intact. I had 3 siblings, a stable life, a stable childhood, always had shelter and food and so forth. There are pieces of me, though. I do believe when we have relationships and we connect with people in a very meaningful, purposeful way throughout our lives, and I think about this as friendships as well. We are part of those pieces. Like, there are pieces of me that are only there because of somebody else. That connection, that relationship, something that stirred in me that I adapted. And when I listen to where my parents came from, even though it's not where I came from, listening to my father and go growing up in the Depression, especially listening to my mother. She was considered what they would call war babies from World War II, where her father was Norwegian and in the Navy over in Scotland. And my grandmother is Scottish. So my mother was a product as a war baby, but then abandoned by her father. There are pieces of me from that story and the strength she had to have to be able to deal with that reality that I'm very conscious of. I'm very conscious of when I meet people or hear stories about abandonment and how that affects other people. So there's an empathy there that now is a piece of me from my parents' origin stories. But I mean, come on, we always laugh, our age group about how our grandparents and our parents would say they walked 5 miles a day in the snow to get to school. Grab your backpack. You only have to get to the corner to catch the bus. I don't want to hear any whining.
I mean, even worse than that, my kids didn't even have to catch the bus. I drove them to school.
I drove mine too. But in general, I mean, we would hear these stories from our parents. So even before I knew what an origin story was, it was buzzing in my head.
I will say a piece of my parents' history that kind of affects my worldview, which is what I think we're talking about with origin stories. I grew up, my parents, my dad was an atheist. I didn't really understand that until I got older and learned some things about his history. And the most important one was my grandparents were very poor. My dad grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. His parents were immigrants. They were never naturalized. They were always Italian immigrants. The whole time they lived in the United States. And they just never have really had any money. When my grandfather died, my father was only 8 years old. And my grandmother didn't have the money to bury him. And so for a week, the body was in a pine box on dry ice in the living room of the flat that they lived in. And what's really significant about that is that that flat had one bedroom, which is where my grandmother and grandfather had slept. There was like a little anteroom with a bed in it that my 2 aunts shared. But my father and my uncle growing up slept in the living room. So at 8 years old, for a week, my father slept on the floor next to the casket with his father's dead body.
Wow.
And I think that deeply affected his religious beliefs, because he would always say to me growing up, there's no afterlife. When you're dead, you're dead.
Right.
And I think it was his childhood self shutting that off to be able to cope with that. It's kind of horrible.
That's horrible.
So that was a piece of, the sort of religious overview. On the other hand, my mother was raised Catholic, and she insisted that we all go to church. We went to, catechism classes. We had to make our communion and our confirmation.
Right.
After confirmation, my brother was allowed to stop going to church, but I had to keep going. And by then my sister was married, so I had to go. And I was the only one who went because my mother didn't go to church. And it was bizarre because she insisted that I go, but she didn't go. And I found out much later it was because she had been married and divorced as a young woman. And when she got divorced, the priest at her church told her, if you go through the divorce, you can never come back to church again. That's it. You're out.
Wow.
And she took that to heart. So I'm a deeply spiritual person, as you know. I have strong faith, as you know, but I am a little bit ambivalent about religion.
Right.
And where religion leads you, because I think it can create a sort of internal conflict for people that doesn't help build faith.
Right. The doctrine piece of it,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And the governance piece of
And also
institutional.
Even with my dad, like you have to believe in heaven and hell, and where that kind of got him.
Right.
He got caught up in it and then rejected everything. So, that's a piece of my origin story, my parents' religious experience that affected the way I view my faith now.
Right. Talking about our origin stories, and yours in particular, talking about that, it made me think of individuals that come from a very specific background or origin story where there was pain with their parents or their grandparents, and yet they don't take on that pain. They either refuse it or they learn and grow from it, but they don't allow that. They don't claim it to be their origin story and moving forward to their children's origin story. I think that takes a lot of strength.
Mm-hmm.
I think it takes really owning yourself and just saying no, putting it in the box that maybe it belongs, and starting your own origin story. Yes, there's a history piece to it, but we can all start over. We could start today, with an origin story that we want to believe and that is in truth, but also that we can leave our children.
I think that takes an awareness of a couple of things. One, it takes an awareness of how significant and impactful childhood experiences are.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our childhood experiences are curated for us by our parents.
That's their narrative.
That's their narrative. They're bringing a lot to the table that they're feeding us.
True.
And when you become aware of that, you can start sort of separating out what's really you and what really was them. And I think that's critical. The other part of it is kind of an awareness that things evolve.
Right.
Like my grandparents were immigrants. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have any money. My parents were American. They didn't speak Italian, that's a whole nother thing. They didn't speak the same language as their parents, which is to me totally wild. But so be it. That's how it was. And they were very middle-class Americans in the middle of the 20th century. So their experiences were very different. So my experience is different from theirs.
Right.
And all of that, like a conscious awareness of that change, that progression, I think is kind of important in fashioning yourself and identifying yourself as who you are.
Kind of in the same thread is perspective is kind of what we're talking about, is the perspective of an origin story. I'm one of four. If you put us all right here in a room and asked us individually to give a paragraph on what our childhood was like, it would be different. Now, our ages span. We're different ages in different countries, so we took a little bit from that as well. But it is that individualism and that perspective as well, that somebody in the same household can literally take away something very different about how they grew up.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there are some very fundamental similarities, of course, like socioeconomic, things like that. But yet the way an individual child reacts or relationship with a certain parent is very different than the next child. Our personalities do play into that as well. And I think that's an interesting piece of origin story in general.
Timing makes a difference too. So,
Yeah.
I have an older sister, but she's a little over 9 years older than me. She graduated from high school in 1971. The first year that the University of Virginia, which is where I ended up going, admitted female undergraduates was 1971. So for her going through high school, the notion of going to college was a little more outside the box than it was 9 years later for me. So I went through high school with the expectation I would go to college. She didn't. Yeah. And that's just same family, different time. And it just totally affects how your life unfolds.
It's true. We've been fortunate enough to have basically a good origin story for ourselves, and we've been able to give that, I think, to our children. My children, I think, would say that. I have friends, though, where they've not been, um, I don't know if blessed is the word, but life didn't give them that. So they may have come from trauma themselves. Do you have any thoughts on if somebody does come from origins and their story involves trauma, how to kind of besides therapy, but how they could leave that in the past somewhat and create a story that feeds their soul, that propels them forward in a positive way, and protect their children in some ways from carrying on those pieces of somebody else's trauma in the reality of their origin story. I'm just curious, just for discussion, because I've thought about that, especially I have one person in my mind right now that's done a really good job of that, but it took about 40 years to get there. And they were very protective not to discuss that with their children
Mm.
because they did not want that piece to be part of their children's origin story. Because some people do hang on to that as that's where they came from too and can't shed that. And it's not always a positive energy that they take forward. What are your thoughts? Do you know anyone that's gone through something like that? Or
I can't say that I do,
yeah,
but I think that a piece of it is recognizing as a parent what your journey as a parent is, what your
mhm,
responsibility as a parent is, and like you just said, the person you're thinking of did a good job of shielding their children. I think a lot of parents look at their children as their healing. So I'm going to have kids that are going to love me. I'm going to have kids that I can relate to.
right,
And instead of thinking of healing themselves so that
mm,
they can give a different history to their children.
right,
So it's a question of focus. I think the key is therapy,
right.
you
I
know?
think so too. I think so too. Think about my father. I've asked him several times. He doesn't talk about his time in Korea, and he was in the 101st Airborne and was a ranger, and I know saw combat. But I'll ask him every once in a while, just tell me a little something. And he doesn't want to talk about it. And I said, I guess it's hard. And he'll say, and I say, I guess it's hard for you. And I'm sorry that I'm asking that. It's mainly out of curiosity and knowing like what you went through. And he goes, but I don't want you to go through it.
Mm.
And I think about those people that don't talk about parts of their lives and parts of their origin because of the pain. But also, I always thought like of veterans, I think they protect themselves as well. And I think that is a big piece of it. But my father definitely alluded to the fact that he did not want me to think of his pain or to know the trauma that he went through. And subconsciously, in a way, is protecting me as well.
There's an interesting dynamic there, though, because on the one hand, I think there are parents that unload their pain on their children for sure, and that's never a good thing. But sharing that you've experienced pain without unloading it, right?
Right.
Without trying to use your children to cure that actually gives a lot of depth to you as a person
Mhm.
and can be very informative to your children to knowing you and understanding you.
Right.
And that's important.
Yeah.
It's a little different because it doesn't have to do with like trauma, but um, my husband's history is very different from mine. I'm 100% Italian. I've had my DNA done. And I know that about myself. It's part of my history. My husband he's got English, Welsh, Scottish, a little Norwegian, apparently, a little Swedish, very little, but some. And his history in this country goes way, 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 way back,
Mhm.
1600s. So his persona is very different. His father, who I loved, my father-in-law was a delightful man, was just a kind, gentle, sweet, thoughtful guy.
Mhm.
And when I met him, I loved him right from the beginning. And he used to always talk about the place where he grew up, Ashley Falls, a little hamlet within the city of Sheffield or the town of Sheffield in Western Massachusetts. And he would talk about Ashley Falls all the time. And when my husband and I were newly married, Harry was a baby. We actually went on a trip to Massachusetts, and we went to Ashley Falls, and we saw the house where my father-in-law grew up. And seeing that place, I was like, oh, now I totally get my father-in-law. I totally understood his personality and who he was by seeing the soil that he came from and the place where he was raised. It's like it was crystal clear. And I think that was super cool,
Yeah.
to kind of see that. And in fact, that
I
house,
understand that.
I think you know this, that the house that he grew up in went up for sale in 2020 during the pandemic. And had it not been the pandemic and the sort of chaos, I said, I would have bought that house
Aw.
just to honor him.
Yeah.
And moved there. And my husband was like, we're not moving to Massachusetts right now. But there was something so telling about seeing the environment that he grew up in.
Yeah, I think that's pretty a beautiful story. And you do find, I think when you do have an understanding of somebody's culture or where they're from, it does come together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you see the picture at the end and it all fits, right?
Right.
I will say on the other side of that, I think there are individuals out there, and I have an experience that I'll talk about some point on this podcast maybe, but we're told stories, we believe the stories, and a lot of people believe the stories that they're telling. But with genealogy and ancestry, or maybe finding relatives that you hadn't had relationships with before, and finding more about the history of your parents or your grandparents, it might not fit the origin story that you've had. It might not fit to what you always thought about yourself or about your parent or about your grandparent. I have had this experience. Not ready to talk about it quite yet, but it is emotionally disruptive. And thinking about not so much for me, but I know for someone in my family, it's been very emotionally disruptive and won't even entertain it because that's not the story that they were told or that they believe in. And at their age, I mean, how do you reconcile that or recreate another story that might make sense in the scientific part of it, but not what you know about your life? And I have thought because of this, other people that are doing genealogy, ancestry, or digging deep into their roots or what they've been told by family members that they end up realizing is just not factual. It's their perspective and it's their truth.
Right.
But it actually might not be the scientific truth.
I think it's really important in those moments to stop and think about what truth really is. So, not through ancestry DNA or having DNA tested, but I learned as a young adult that my sister is actually a half sister. I did not know that.
Right, I remember.
And when it came, because my mother had been married before, my sister was the daughter of her first marriage. When I learned that, and my mother ultimately shared that information, she was just distraught.
Yeah,
she actually thought that I was going to hate her, or that it was a terrible thing, and it was interesting to me because from my perspective, it changed nothing. My sister's still my sister.
right.
I don't really care. I mean, I can't say I don't care. It's impactful for her because she never knew her dad.
Right.
But it didn't change anything for me. So even though the story was different than the story I thought was the truth, at the end of the day, it didn't affect me in a meaningful way.
Well, I think origin stories can be important, but then also I think that you don't have to emphasize or live your life based on an origin story. Like, I don't really think about it a whole lot. I mean, I know we started the episode talking a little bit about how we do think about it or not think about it. Even raising my children, I just wanted to give them the best home environment,
right,
and be the best mother that I could be. I didn't sit and think, okay, my kids are going to have a narrative in their head. They're going to think about an origin story. I need to make sure that, I provide a life that propels them, into this world in a very positive advantage type way. Never thought about it. But origin stories are real, and they do affect people. We don't have to have it affect us a lot. But I think the first generation of the way we are raised, because I always think about my grandparents and my parents' story more than my own story and more than the story maybe I'm providing for my children.
And on that point, I would say if you're a young parent, if you have young kids at home, be honest about who you are.
Mm-hmm.
That's where people get tripped up because they try to sell a story of themselves to their children that they think looks good and is inspiring and is morally righteous and uplifting. But what's really, I think, important to kids is truth.
I agree.
Because if they find out later that you sold them a bill of goods, that's going to, as you say, it can be very disruptive.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't for me, but it could be for other people.
Right.
I've always been very honest with my kids. My kids knew from the beginning that I had been married before. Is there a reason they needed to know that information? No. But it's a piece of my history that I wanted to be honest about.
Right.
And I never wanted to hide, so I never hid it.
Yeah.
And it came up in weird ways, but there you go.
Well, and I think kids get strength from knowing where their parents came from and the struggles and things. Like I said, I carry pieces of both my parents. My father, knowing that he came up in the Depression era, and pieces of my mother, of being abandoned and at times having to go into foster care. It's definitely made me more empathetic, but it also has helped me realize the effects that has on somebody. And so making sure that my own children wouldn't have to go through that as well. But the honesty in all of that, even telling our children, like I can tell you my children think a lot of my mother and know that she came actually from nothing. And this is a woman that ended up going on to school and not only nursing, but she was a nurse practitioner when I was a kid before you even heard about it. Director of nurses. I mean, her career was unbelievable in an age where women in nursing did not rise to that. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of pride in knowing where somebody came from, their origin, and how they pulled themselves up. And of course, our parents and grandparents always tell us like those stories as well. But it is good to hear, but I think there's parts of it that we can leave behind if it's negative or if it doesn't serve us well. I think it's okay to let that go. What do you think?
I like to tell the whole story.
Well, it's not telling the whole story, but like for trauma and people that have had incestual type experiences, there are some people, it might not be us, but in general, there are pieces of people's lives that are very rough and very hard.
And again, I think it goes to if you're sharing that information because you want affirmation or healing or curing from your children,
right?
You should not be sharing.
No, that's what I'm saying. You take pieces and other pieces you can leave behind. It's something that happened in history, but it doesn't have to move forward. But it's still part of somebody's origin, but it doesn't mean it has to be the grandchild's.
Right.
Or, some things are important hereditary science-wise. Of things that might have happened in a family, causes of death and things like that are important to share for sure.
But sometimes sharing even those trauma stories can become important if you have a child facing a particular struggle and you want to empower them to overcome it.
Right.
So it's a question of why. Why are you sharing this information?
Right.
And if you're going to share it, be accurate about it.
Right. So, I think that there are things that we can take forward and there's things that we can let go of. Mm-hmm. And there are some things that should just be let go of as well. But I wish I had thought about origin story more with my children. I did share they know about my life. They know about my husband's life. And there are pieces I think about my son right now, who grew up, born in Texas. Both my sons grew up in Northern Virginia in the D.C. area, and one of them's moved back to Texas. And because we visited Texas a lot, and he knows he's 6th-generation Texan, let me tell you, he's got his boots on, he's got his jeans. I mean, he doesn't always look like this preppy Northern Virginia kid that he grew up to be at this stage, that he is claiming this origin story of being this Texan. And it's fun to watch because it is part of his history.
Yeah.
And now it's part of him in a different way. And it's fun to watch that.
I think it's actually really important when you have kids to take the time to write down your story, to share information. And we are actually in the process of doing that. In fact, for Father's Day, Harry, my son, bought for Dave this journal, and it has a series of questions about
Right.
Dave's life that he's supposed to write the answers to so that we can preserve that for Harry and we can preserve that for his kids. And I think that's really important because some of the information that I have about my grandparents, I think there's a mix of fact and fiction. It's fun to tell the stories. I'm not sure they're 100% true. But I would like to be able to give my kids and leave for my grandkids a more accurate recounting of who we are and what we've done.
Our children at our age are much more cognizant of that. That gift that you're talking about, both my kids have given that to my husband and I several years ago. They want to know.
Mhm.
The other thing is my oldest son he loves to do little video clips. He loves my Instagram. To him, that is a history of me. It's documenting my life. And so, yeah, I love a little bit of social media. I enjoy it. But my kids actually have verbalized how important it is for them.
I am very conscious of the fact that in doing this podcast, we are creating a history for our kids and grandkids. As long as the technology always exists for them to access this is me being laid bare for them. I mean, we're pretty
Right.
open and honest in
Yes,
this
we are.
episodes.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that I'm leaving a video record, an audio
Yeah.
record of who I am.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
No, it is. Talking about leaving, I don't know what made me think about this, Leslie Ann, but in talking about the video and leaving pieces, for our family, I have 2 voicemails on my phone of friends that have passed away. I also have 2 text message threads, and I can't let go of it. It's not my origin story, but there is something about hearing someone's voice or listening to their words that is sacred. To me, there's a sacred piece to that, and it is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, there's somebody whose words I'd like to hear right now, and that's our lovely producer, Elizabeth, who always has great questions. And for our listeners, Elizabeth gets to listen to every episode, and she has really great insight. So, Elizabeth, do you have any questions about origin stories?
I do. If someone met the 8-year-old version of you, what would surprise them the most about who you've become?
Oh, I think for me, that's actually kind of easy to answer. I was actually really shy. I was very quiet. I read all the time. In fact, when I was a kid, there's kind of it's a piece of an origin story. We used to have big family gatherings because my mother had a lot of siblings and my dad had several siblings. And, the cousins would all come over. And I just hated that. I did not like all the hubbub. So I would take a flashlight and go hide in the closet with a book to read. And my dad would knock on the door and say, Leslie Ann, get out of that closet and go play with the other children. And I was that shy. And I am not shy now.
No.
So that's been a big change in my life.
That does surprise me. Okay, my 8-year-old self, I'm placing myself in Sydney, Australia. I'm placing myself in my backyard, and we had bird baths, and I would go and collect the tadpoles, and I'd put them in little dishes. So I think of that as a tomboyish kind of thing, and I'm not a tomboyish piece. But the other piece to that, I'd put it in dishes, and this probably is more me. I would go and give them to my neighbors. So I think the tomboy piece of me collecting tadpoles and then fishing later, I love fishing to this day, is something that would probably surprise people.
Do you feel more like you are a product of your family, your culture, or your rebellion?
I actually would have to say my rebellion. I am very conscious of my origin story and of my family, and I love my family. But I grew up feeling a little bit like a fish out of water. I just didn't feel like I fit in. And I really worked very hard to become who I thought I was, which was a little bit different than the rest of my family. I mean, that's just kind of reality. Going off to college was a big deal because I was breaking away to just become something else. And I think that my life really began for me when I went to UVA.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It's true.
Yeah. I think family. And I think family, I'm more of a product of my family because my family was adventurous. My family was a close unit. It's how I try to live my life now, both adventurously and keeping my family close and to my heart. There's a little bit of culture there as well. I'm very proud of the culture that I came from, but I live in a different country than my mother, who is culturally very different. So I would definitely say family.
What part of your origin story do you find yourself rewriting or reclaiming the older you get?
For me, I think I reclaimed the adventurous piece of when I was a child and moving from country to country or culture to culture. I'm reclaiming that. I realize now, even though at times it felt difficult to move to from Sydney, Australia to Arkansas, now when I look at adventure and see the significant change of culture, whether I travel or in the United States or not, or even I get excited about it. Like there is, yeah, I go on fire.
I think for me, I actually grew up feeling pretty close to my dad, not as close to my mom. And a lot of the attitudes and actions I took ended up being actually more like my mom, who was a much more dynamic person. As I get older, I'm trying to become more of a quiet person. And that's conscious. I'm trying to explore that part of myself again because I let it go. And partly I needed to do that to propel myself forward. But my dad was actually a very quiet man. And his whole family was very quiet. They were all readers. They lived very, I would say, small lives. They didn't have big social circles. I've always had a big social circle. I've done a lot of things. I'm very adventurous. As you know, I travel. But I'm actually now in retirement trying to explore a little bit more, spending time alone and being quiet.
There's a lot of strength in the quiet places.
Mm-hmm.
There is.